Russia planted its flag in the Caribbean, and in Washington, the tremor was felt almost immediately. At the very height of the tightening siege on Havana, Vladimir Putin leveraged what should have been a routine ceremony in the Kremlin to send a political shockwave across the Atlantic. The message was clear. Moscow doesn't just support Cuba, it is now publicly positioning itself as a bulwark against the American blockade and its policy of interference. Standing before a silent assembly of dozens of ambassadors, the Russian leader didn't mince words or hide behind the hollow, carefully constructed phrases of diplomatic speak. Instead, he looked directly at the Cuban delegation and, in a voice that carried the weight of the gilded hall, proclaimed his unwavering solidarity with the island's defense of its sovereignty and independence. In that single moment, a standard diplomatic protocol was transformed into an open challenge to Washington. The full story is next. From Moscow to the Malecon, the message could not have been more explicit. Russia was drawing a line in the sand, standing shoulder to shoulder with Cuba, at the precise moment Washington was tightening the economic noose around Havana's neck. Putin, a master of political theater, used the grand stage of a credentialing ceremony in the Kremlin to fire a strategic warning shot against the American blockade. With the world's media spotlight fixed upon him, standing in a cavernous hall adorned with centuries of imperial history, surrounded by the envoys of nations great and small, the Russian president addressed the Cuban delegation without a shred of ambiguity. He didn't just offer pleasantries. He reminded them, and by extension, the world, that Moscow stands in solidarity with Cuba's fierce determination to defend its right to self-govern. This was no mere diplomatic courtesy, no empty gesture for the cameras. It was a full-throated declaration of support delivered in the midst of an increasingly overt global power struggle. During the formal presentation of credentials, a ceremony usually defined by its predictable pageantry, Putin went out of his way to insist that Russia's bond with the island was not a product of temporary political convenience. He took pains to remind his audience that Russia and the Republic of Cuba share what he called a truly ironclad and friendly relationship. It was a deliberate choice of words, meant to evoke a history that has weathered the fall of empires, the collapse of ideological blocs, catastrophic economic crises, and wave after relentless wave of sanctions, all without fracturing. The Russian premier seemed determined to hammer home the point that this was not a friendship of symbols, but of substance. We have always provided, and will continue to provide, assistance to our Cuban friends, he stated, his voice steady. That single sentence was a dagger, expertly crafted to contrast two fundamentally opposed worldviews. While some governments, most notably the one in Washington, choose to suffocate the island, to starve it of resources and opportunities, Russia was now boasting of its commitment to stand by Cuba, especially when the pressure is at its most intense. He also emphasized something that can't be measured in barrels of oil or balance sheets: the human foundation of their connection. Putin spoke of the sincere mutual empathy between the peoples of both nations, framing the alliance not as a cold, calculated pact between governments, but as the natural outcome of a shared history, a history defined by resistance to economic body blows, repeated attempts at international isolation, and unrelenting external pressure. It was a narrative of two peoples who understood, on a visceral level, what it meant to stand firm against a hostile world. And to ensure no one mistook his words for mere rhetoric, the head of the Kremlin began listing concrete examples of their partnership. He highlighted that Moscow and Havana are jointly implementing projects that are vital to the Cuban economy. He wasn't speaking in abstracts, he was naming the pillars of a modern society. He spoke of cooperation in the energy sector, which translates to keeping the lights on in Havana's hospitals and homes. He mentioned metallurgy, which means jobs and the raw materials for rebuilding. He pointed to transportation infrastructure, the very arteries of the nation, its roads, its ports. And he spoke of medicine, a sector where Cuba has long punched above its weight, but which has been crippled by the blockade's restrictions on supplies and equipment. This wasn't just cooperation, it was a lifeline, translating directly into electricity, employment, highways, and hospitals. Putin then added that their shared agenda extends beyond investments and factories. He underscored that both countries are actively expanding cultural and humanitarian exchanges. For a nation subjected to more than 6 decades of a suffocating embargo, this detail is anything but trivial. Every cultural exchange, every visiting artist or student, is a window opened in a room where others are desperately trying to seal off the doors and board up the glass. Each interaction is an act of defiance, a crack in the wall of isolation that Washington has painstakingly tried to build around the island. This tangible Russian support stands in stark, almost jarring, contrast to the direction the United States has been taking in the region. Following the covert operations against Venezuela, which Caracas has denounced as a campaign of aggression culminating in what they term the kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro, the administration of Donald Trump escalated its threats not only against Cuba, but also against Mexico, consistently choosing punishment over any semblance of political dialogue. On the rhetorical front, Trump abandoned even the thinnest veil of diplomatic euphemism. He went so far as to publicly state that going in and smashing Cuba might be the only way to force a change on the island. It was a brutal, astonishingly frank admission that revealed the raw logic underpinning Washington's policy. If a nation refuses to bend to your will, you simply destroy it, with no regard for the human cost. Faced with this climate of open intimidation, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel reaffirmed Havana's unwavering stance. He explained with deliberate calm that there were no ongoing conversations with the United States government, aside from a few technical contacts regarding migration. He drew a clear line. There will be no political dialogue as long as the other side insists on a language of threats, blacklists, and unilateral demands. The Cuban leader reminded the world that any bilateral relationship must be built on the foundation of international law, not on a bedrock of hostility, intimidation, and economic coercion. Cuba, he said in essence, is not asking for special treatment. It is asking for clear rules and respect for its sovereignty, principles that are supposed to be the bare minimum in an international system that claims to be governed by norms and laws. Díaz-Canel also responded to the pressure from the White House with a message steeped in a history of resistance. He condemned the Trump administration's threats and declared that his country was prepared to defend the homeland to the last drop of blood. This isn't a mere slogan pulled from a dusty, revolutionary pamphlet. It is a phrase that encapsulates decades of enduring assassination attempts, thwarted invasions, and crippling sabotage campaigns. Cuba is a free, independent, and sovereign nation, he stressed, his words echoing across the Caribbean. No one tells us what to do. That single statement captures the profound, and perhaps unexpected, consequence of the American blockade. Far from crushing the Cuban spirit and forcing surrender, the policy has forged a national identity defined by an unbreakable sense of dignity. It has cultivated a political culture of resistance that explains, more than any economic chart, why the island remains standing, defiant, despite decades of economic asphyxiation. To truly grasp the gravity of the current moment, one has to look at the relentless, sustained nature of Washington's policy. For over 60 years, the United States has maintained a commercial and economic blockade that has only been intensified over time with a cascading series of unilateral sanctions. The impact of this siege is all-encompassing. It touches everything from life-saving medicines and fuel for ambulances to basic foodstuffs and spare parts for farming equipment. It chokes off access to medical technology and the essential tools for development. The consequences are well documented and devastating. The blockade inflates the cost of every transaction, obstructs access to international credit, scares away potential foreign investment, and actively threatens third-party nations that dare to trade with the island. This is not a simple ideological disagreement between two capitals. It is a multi-generational strategy of collective punishment, meticulously designed to create scarcity, fuel social unrest, and generate overwhelming internal pressure to topple the Cuban government. And although Washington attempts to frame the blockade as a simple bilateral issue, a private dispute between neighbors, the scene at the United Nations tells a radically different story. Year after year, The UN General Assembly passes a resolution condemning the American policy with a near-unanimous, overwhelming majority. This annual vote leaves the United States almost completely isolated on the world stage, often accompanied by only a handful of unconditional allies, standing in opposition to the entire international community. This near-total condemnation reveals a glaring paradox at the heart of American foreign policy. The very power that proclaims itself the guarantor of the global order systematically ignores the resolutions of the world's highest international body the moment they conflict with its own strategic interests. It is into this chasm of incoherence that Russia has stepped. Moscow now positions itself as one of the few global actors that not only denounces the blockade in speeches, but actively confronts it with concrete cooperation and aid for Havana. Putin, however, used his platform in the Kremlin to look beyond the shores of Cuba. He reminded the assembled diplomats that Moscow has long maintained close and constructive interaction and relationships with many Latin American countries. He emphasized that Russia has always treated the states of the region with great respect as equal and independent partners, free from condescension or colonial oversight. Consistent with this narrative, the Russian president explicitly noted that this vision of partnership fully applies to the countries represented here, and he then named Colombia, Peru, and Uruguay. In other words, he was making a direct offer, extending a hand to the wider region. It was an offer of a relationship based on agreements between sovereign states, a model standing in obvious and deliberate contrast to Washington's long and bloody history of interventions, sponsored coups, and economic strong-arming throughout Latin America. Putin insisted that there were abundant opportunities to significantly expand trade, investment, and commercial ties between Russia and the region. On a geopolitical map where the centers of power are visibly shifting and new alliances are being forged, this overture represents a tangible opportunity for Latin America. It offers a path to diversify its partners, to build new economic bridges, and to reduce its historical, often suffocating, dependence on a single dominant power to its north. The head of the Kremlin also took time to focus on sectors that are particularly sensitive and crucial for Latin American societies. He spoke of cooperation in public health and the pharmaceutical industry, and in education and professional training. He was signaling a desire for a relationship that goes far beyond the simple extraction of raw materials, one that includes the strengthening of a nation's own capabilities and the fortification of its public services. While this Russian agenda of partnership and development unfolds, Washington's policy continues to revolve around a tired playbook of sanctions and ultimatums. When a government deviates from the prescribed American line, it is immediately branded a regime. Blockades are activated, media campaigns are launched, and devastating financial pressures are brought to bear. It happened with Cuba, it was repeated with Venezuela, and it is the same template being applied to any nation that dares to walk a path not dictated by Washington. By publicly taking up Havana's defense, Russia is sending a message that reverberates far beyond the Caribbean. It is a message to the rest of Latin America that there are alternatives to submission. It is a declaration that no people are obligated to accept a foreign power telling them what political model they are allowed to have, or what economic agreements they are permitted to sign. Against this backdrop, charged with geopolitical tension, the scene itself is profoundly eloquent. While the United States reinforces its 6-decade-long blockade against a small Caribbean island, a nation fighting for its survival, Russia crosses oceans to proclaim from the heart of the Kremlin its solidarity with Cuba's right to defend its own sovereignty. It's a gesture that, today, resonates far beyond the streets of Havana, echoing in capitals across the world where nations are beginning to question the old certainties and look for a new way forward. I'm Jackson Pierce for the Clarion Call. Our mission here is to provide the kind of in-depth, independent analysis that you rarely get from the mainstream networks. If you believe in this work and want to see more of it, the best way to support us is to become part of our community. Hit that subscribe button, and if you want to be notified every time we release a new report, make sure to ring the notification bell. This channel is entirely listener-supported, and if you're in a position to help us keep the lights on and continue this journalism, you can do so through the PayPal link in the description below. Every contribution, no matter the size, makes a real difference and allows us to remain fiercely independent. On behalf of the entire team here at the Clarion Call, I want to thank you for listening. Until we meet again.